Good evening, everyone, and welcome to TNN News Raw. I'm your host, Mr. Tommy Sotomayor. And tonight, guys, we have a very, very special guest. You've seen him talk to me before. We talked a couple of times. We're going to talk tonight about politics. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about Dr. David Duke and his run for Senate in Louisiana. So without further ado, let me bring him on the panel. Dr. David Duke, how's it going, brother?
Doing great. How are you?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about several different things. So I'd like to first off welcome Dr. David Duke to the show.
Yes, sir.
All right. I want to start off with just asking you simply, a lot of people may not know that you're currently running for Senate in Louisiana. So talk to us of what makes you want to get back into this political arena?
Well, people have been contacting me over the last few weeks, actually months, and saying that I got a duty to do it. This government is going crazy. The politics of this country are just absolutely insane. This nation well, this is what they're saying. I'll put it very crudely. But I hear from, and you hear from people like saying the same thing. This country's going to hell. I mean, it's really, everything is going to hell. We see this incredible violence. We see this loss of our middle class. The middle class is shrinking in this country. We see this loss of values in this country, and we have a media in this nation that preaches and pushes every sort of degeneracy and destructiveness for our kids. I know you have a daughter, and I'm sure you don't want your daughter to see a lot of this programming on television, obviously, because it pushes every sort of degeneracy, destructiveness, drug use, sexual license. It's just amazing, and we're really losing this country on so many levels. We have massive immigration coming in, which is affecting us in incredible negative ways. I've just been working on a video about that, in fact, today. Over the last few decades, we've had millions and millions of illegal aliens because our government has not enforced our laws. We have also had a legal immigration that was changed in 1965. And over these years, we've had just millions, and I'm talking about millions of criminal violations, criminal attacks upon American citizens by the illegals and other immigrants coming in. They also are flooding an already overburdened welfare structure, what they call entitlement structure in this country. The taxpayer, the hardworking middle-class person, is paying more and more, and he's getting less and less. We have a situation where millions of Americans literally can't use the educational system that their own taxes pay for. We have a situation where we have a massive flood of these non-U.S. citizens and other immigrants in our prison systems. That costs a huge amount of money. There's just so many different areas, it seems, that America is losing it. And it's about time that we begin to stand up and talk about the issues that are really confronting us. We have to deal with this illegal alien immigration. We are losing many of our jobs. The working people of this country are losing their jobs. A lot of businesses that want to stay in America, rather than have to go overseas to compete, they're in a bind, because it's like the way it's structured in this country. They have to go overseas to compete because of the trade policies that we have, which are bad for European American people. They're bad for African American people. They're bad for any person that's traditionally in this country. And we have basically we have a government that's selling us out. We have a political system that is completely dominated and controlled by these oligarchs of banking and international finance. If you look at Hillary Clinton, for instance, she's got 7 major contributors, all but one, and the other one is a media mogul and a banker, are these so-called hedge fund brokers. I saw the figures the other day. Hillary Clinton got $147 million in this cycle alone, 147 million from these international bankers, which they're just predator bankers. Goldman Sachs and George Soros, these guys are criminals. They are criminal bankers who are robbing us blind. The Federal Reserve, I see the Federal Reserve as a criminal organization. This organization has taken over the currency policy of the United States of America. And no longer does even the Congress or the president control our economic policy. These unelected Federal Reserve czars are the people that set this policy. We had that bailout, remember, back in 2008, and they literally, the head of the Federal Reserve at that time, Ben Shalom Bernanke, he passed out an unbelievable figure of 23.7 trillion, I'm saying trillion, not billion, $1 trillion to his crony banker buddies. You know, the whole national debt is 19 trillion. Now, this is from Bloomberg, press, and which is a very major financial network. This is according to the auditor, Mr. Aronofsky, who did this. And he did this. He passed out this money. And by the way, if they gave Mr. Sotomayor, if they gave you $1 billion just for a couple of days, you're fixed for life. Yeah. Because just passing out money itself is huge. And so they set the value of the money. They know what the currency rates are. They really actually, they set these vital parts of our economy, and the Congress actually has no say in it, other than theoretically having impact on who the Federal Reserve chairman is and vice chairman is, because that goes through Congress. But that's because, those decisions are made because of these giant, hedge fund operators and banksters that are the biggest single part of our campaign financing in America. Now, these massive amounts of money in campaigns are nothing more than just massive bribes. And that's why they get away with these thefts. Like Goldman Sachs stole about $500 billion. They ruined millions of lives. They caused millions of people to lose their homes, lose their life savings, not just in America, in fact, all over the world. This is a criminal predator bank of huge proportions. And even the federal government admitted this, but they got let off the hook because they dominate the politicians, because they decided who those politicians are, who protected them. They dominate the judges. They dominate the prosecution, Lanny Brower, the judge. That's how they get away with this stuff. And they literally control American politics. And there's got to be a change there. I believe that we've got to have a very, very powerful campaign finance reform, where the way we should judge and vote and decide who our politicians are, who our leaders are, our president, our Congress, our Senate, we should do that by their principles, not how much money is behind them to create these, Superman can fly commercials. With modern video, you can even make a guy look like this guy like Clark Kent, become Superman and fly. You can make a politician look honest, right? You can make these people look like they're great people. That's not the way we should be deciding who our candidates are and who our representatives are. We should be judging them by their principles and the way they present themselves, not by how much money they have behind them. And also media. Who elected the heads of CNN, who runs CNN, who elected these people to their positions? It's unelected, but they have more power than any senator. Even Solzhenitsyn said that, the great Russian writer and freedom fighter from what was the Soviet Union. And later I got to know him, luckily, before he died. And even he said that. He said, well, by who elected these people to this tremendous positions of power, and to whom are they responsible? So I don't think the government of this country is responsible to the people. And I think that in so many ways, we're losing the values of this country in every way possible. And we're losing the well-being of our people. And we're fighting these crazy wars all over the world, which is not helping us. We recently, as you know, Clinton was one of the people that supported ISIS. Literally, our government, when we talk about this ISIS terrorism, that we've been afflicted by in Europe and the United States, this existed and got its foothold because the government of the United States of America was supporting ISIS, was supporting al-Nusra, which is actually an al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria and otherwise. And our government went into Syria, which has, by the way, 3 million Christians, as well as Sunni and Shiite Muslims, but 3 million Christians. And our government literally supported these jihadists, these ISIS jihadist radicals against the government, and against the government that was a secular government. The girls and women in Syria could go around without a haircut, even a head covering. They were in the universities. And we actually supported these jihadist revolutionaries because that was part of the of the policy of this country for other objectives. This kind of stuff's got to change, and this is because we have a tiny elite that controls our governmental policy in this country rather than the people, and we select our leaders basically by how much money and power is behind them, and that's got to change.
All right, you spoke about money and power behind them. Right now, we have a system of where there's a lot of large banks that are bankrolling the majority of the candidates, and your speakers are giving me feedback a little bit. But we have a lot of banks bankrolling these candidates. My question to you is, what's the difference between Hillary and Donald Trump and any other candidate when it comes to this?
Well, I've always found it interesting when a lot of people claim themselves to be anti-establishment. You know, they hate Donald Trump. But the truth is that Donald Trump, if there's ever any person that's hated by the media establishment, that's hated by the banking establishment, that's hated by the political establishment, it's Donald Trump. I mean, we had these corrupt Republicans who literally manipulated and stole votes and representation. You know, we have a country, the basic principle of America is we have rule by the people. And then when people vote, that's who we should represent. We had people who were delegates, right? Who the people, nobody who vote, they were voting for the candidate. They were voting for Donald Trump or Rubio or Cruz or these other candidates, Jeb Bush or whatever. And the people didn't even know who the delegates were. And then these corrupt bosses came along and said, oh, well, these people have to vote their conscience, the delegates. You know, no, these people were elected to be delegates because the people voted for a particular candidate. And we have a very corrupt system in Louisiana. The Never Trump people literally gave 10 more delegates to the guy that lost the Republican primary rather than the guy that won the Republican primary. So he won the vote of the people. He got less delegates than the guy that lost. This is the kind of corruption we have in politics.
Well, let me ask you about the pushback, because a lot of people had asked me, remember CNN had put out there that you had backed Trump. A lot of people are wanting to know right now, when you look at Hillary and Trump, what do your eyes say? What does your political savvy say? What does your common sense say and your governmental want for our country say between the two candidates?
Well, let's look at the powers in the world. Let's look at the international bankers. Let's look at these international corporations who have no loyalty other than how much wealth and power they can amass. And it's a destructive power. There's no question about where the globalist banking power is coming down. They're for Hillary. And there's no question that these powers also want this massive immigration for a lot of reasons. They want this massive immigration for one reason, is because it's absolutely enables them to have more control. We need a strong and viable middle class in this country, and there's no real democracy that can ever exist or flourish without a very strong middle class. And we're very much headed in this country toward, we have a few very rich people and a very smaller and smaller middle class, and then a bunch of real poor people, you know, the people that really have very little power. That's how a tyranny controls people. You know, a viable and intelligent, you know, educated middle class is essential to a nation to really to have great progress and to be free. And they're really trying to eliminate that, and I think they are. They are really making us, we get poor. We've seen the American middle class go down dramatically in their abilities. I mean, just years ago, I can remember back as a young man. I'm getting up there in age, but I can remember back very, very well when the young couple could start out. They could afford to buy a house, and only one member of the family had to work. I mean, if the woman did not want to work and wanted to stay home and raise the children and do the other aspects of what they wanted to do with their lives and the family, which is a healthy thing because the kids had a lot of supervision then and a lot of guidance, they could do that. They could do that then. Today, even two working members of the same family, a man and wife, they can hardly even pay the bills, and very few people can actually go out and buy a decent house these days. And that's becoming less and less because America, we're losing all that aspect of our economy.
When you think of where we are right now, especially in Louisiana, you talked about immigration. Maybe you can tell some of us how immigration and the lack thereof of the government enforcing it has affected your state?
Well, it's affected us in so many ways. I mean, you could go into the prisons of Louisiana. We have a very high percentage of the prison population that is composed of illegal aliens. We have a situation where we have, we've really had a tremendous, what you call social welfare or entitlement problem for years. I served in the Health and Welfare Committee in the Louisiana House of Representatives. And we've got what you call, you've talked about this some yourself, Mr. Sotomayor, we've got a rising welfare underclass who is totally dependent upon the government. They tend to have a higher birth rate, and that also limits those mothers, most of them unwed, and there's not a present father in that family. That also tends to continue the deeper social problems as well. The money that comes out for these programs is massive. And we're finding that so much of the so-called immigrants, and I'll tell you something, we can talk about illegal immigration, which is a real problem. I think our government has a fundamental duty to protect our borders. Like Donald Trump says, and what I've said for years, you can't have a country if you can't protect your borders. But also we've had illegal immigration. And if you look at the generations of some of this legal immigration, you've got the same kind of difficulties in terms of a lot of the immigration from Mexico that was legal. You look at the generations and you look at the amount of people in the welfare system and the entitlement system. You have illegal aliens. I'll tell you a story if you could bear with me for a moment, but it's a very powerful story. When I was running for a governor years ago in Lake Charles, Louisiana, a gentleman came up to me with his wife, and they had a young girl there, a daughter, and they said, look, we want to show you something. And they showed me the daughter, who was about 6 or 7, and she had a very dark red scar down her chest. And what happened was that they had insurance. The man was a very successful man. He started off as a tugboat worker, worked his way up. Eventually, he saved and scrimped and fought, and he finally ended up buying an old tug and fixing it up and starting a tugboat. And then he became very successful, about 3 or 4 tugboats. He made a lot of money. He was always generous to his friends and neighbors, his community. And he had insurance. But the insurance policy, his wife is pregnant. And they said, well, we'll put the child on the insurance, of course, after she's here. Well, she's born with a heart defect. So guess what? They wouldn't put her on the insurance policy. And she had to have a series of operations that were costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. He just could not get any help from the government. He's been paid huge amounts of taxes for a long time, but he couldn't get any help. He went over to a hospital in Houston. From Lake Charles to Houston's pretty close. And he's talking to the people in the hospital, and the hospital is full of illegal aliens, or not even American citizens, never paid a penny in taxes. And they're in there getting the same kinds of operations that his daughter needed, and they're not paying a penny. And the doctor's explaining to them that the reason why the costs are so much is because the hospital has to provide these, and because the government gives so much, because they're just obligated to take any person that has a problem. Now, think about that for a second. Here's a guy who's been paying in taxes for years. He can't get any help. Ultimately, he lost his business. He lost his home, because obviously he was not going to let his daughter die. He was going to do whatever he had to do to make his daughter well again. That's the kind of sickness that we have in this country. It's not just his daughter's sick. It's a sick system. When a person pays into the system for years, pays taxes, has many employees that he's had for this company, enriching those people's lives in this country, and then he's at the back of the bus when it comes to medical care. But an illegal alien can come in, sometimes even cross the border just to do that, even if they get a legal visa. Then they show up at the hospital, and that's all paid for by the hardworking people. Something is wrong with that system, in my opinion. What do you think?
I agree with you 100% that the system is broken. But then the next question has to be, why do you think that they're able to get away with having a broken system when the people, like you spoke of the young man who had to go through hoops to get the same thing that an illegal could get for free? Why do you think we as a people are allowing that and are continuing to vote in people who are creating this system? Because it appears that the people are being doormats and allowing this. I
think there's a lot of reasons. I think the main reason is that we don't really have a voice. the media sounds like they always try to say that they're just this great advocacy for justice and for people. They're not. Otherwise, they would talk about these kinds of injustices and they'd make them clear. And they'd also expose these politicians. But you have to understand there's an unholy alliance between the political establishment, the media establishment, and the money establishment. And that's really primarily it's international banking. And there's a reason why that these international bankers are at the very top of the money scale in America. You know, if I'm a believer in free enterprise. I believe in the idea of private property. I believe in the idea of not what you call capitalism, because that's a perversion of the term, but I do believe in free enterprise. I do believe that a man and men and women should be able to join together in a company, create a great enterprise, work hard, create a great product, and do things with it. But there's a problem when you have people that basically are just shifting money around, who extract literally trillions of dollars from the system. A good example is at Goldman Sachs, the classic example, the largest, most damaging predator bank in the world. They literally stole $500 billion, not just from the people at large. They stole them even from their own investors. That is, pension funds and individual people in their retirement funds who came to them to invest their money. And then Goldman Sachs sold them these derivatives, what they call these derivatives, which Goldman Sachs itself knew were worthless, put them in their portfolios. At the same time that Mr. Blankfein and Mr. Cohn and the owners of Goldman Sachs were dumping them because they knew they weren't worth anything. They sold them to their own people. They destroyed literally tens of thousands of lives. People saved all their lives, lost their retirement. We had pension funds that went broke. We had whole countries go broke because of some of the shenanigans of Goldman Sachs. And that's the largest predator bank on the planet. Now, these guys have been the biggest single contributor in American politics for the President of the United States than any other corporate entity in this country. Goldman Sachs, which is basically a money shuffler. It's not a producer, doesn't really produce one bit of real wealth in America. It doesn't build one car. It doesn't, make one new product. They basically try to manipulate the market and they extract. And where that extraction comes from is from the companies, the businesses, and the people, the working people that produce the real goods and services of America.
How did we get ourselves in this situation to where a Goldman Sachs could do this? What part of the United States government got turned over to the bankers? When did it happen? And what can we do to try and take it back?
Well, probably the origin of a lot of this came about in the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which was passed, I think, on Christmas Eve. It was late in the season when most of the people were going home, and they kind of snuck it through. And the Federal Reserve is an amazing thing. They kind of act like it's part of the government. So actually, it's called the Federal Reserve Bank. But it really is actually private bankers, which are supposed to have a degree of government oversight. But that's all a bunch of hooey, because, in fact, I've got an interview that I've done in some of my YouTube videos of Alan Greenspan, for instance, one of the most famous heads of the Federal Reserve Bank. And he talks, and they ask him about, what's your relationship with the President of the United States? And he says, well, my relationship with the President of the United States is pretty good, as long as the President knows he can't tell us what to do. We're the only independent agency in the government, and they can't tell us what monetary policy we can do. Now, imagine that for a second. Now, this Federal Reserve has, what the Federal Reserve does with interest rates, what they do in monetary policy, is the biggest single factor in a strong, good economy or a bad economy, whether the stock market's going to go up or whether it's going to go down, whether your currency is going to get more valuable or less value, affecting your trade, everything. Now, think about it for a second, where the President of the United States, the elected Congress of the United States, both Senate and congressmen, that you have no impact on the decisions of the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. Now, theoretically, you can change it by replacing the guy, or for the president to pick another head of the Federal Reserve, but that's not. But still, it's basically, these are unelected people, and the reason why they're there is because they're put up by people like Goldman Sachs, because Goldman Sachs has their claws into every major candidate in the United States, and this is a criminal bank.
Well, let me ask: is it Is the Fed an actual bank, and is it a part of the government, or is it a private institution?
It's actually private banks. The only part of the public aspect of it is that it has this government oversight. And it was like in a quasi-official or quasi-government, but it's not really government. These are privately owned banks, and they have shareholders, and that's not the American people. These are private concerns, and they make absolutely hundreds of billions of dollars. And they basically, and because these insiders set policy, they're able, whenever they do something, it's kind of like insider information. Their friends and their cohorts are ahead of the game. The public is behind the game. So if they pass on the information to those that they want, they can literally draw trillions of dollars out of the economy. Just draw it out, because they know ahead of time where they can know ahead of time where the interest rates are going. They can know ahead of time, so you have this collusion. It's almost like a mafia. It's like a private club, and you know, the Federal Reserve won't even allow an audit of the Federal Reserve by the Congress. Now imagine that. This is the people that coin our money, but we don't even have a right to audit. The Congress didn't even have a right to audit. They had a bill for this, and by the way, Bernie Sanders talked a lot about some of the excesses of the Federal Reserve and about the bailout. For instance, they wouldn't even tell us who they bailed out the money to. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars, and they wouldn't give us. Ben Shalom Bernanke got up before Congress, and they said, you know, well, who did you give these trillions of dollars to? Well, I can't say that. I can't tell you that. You know, it's like, okay, this is our government, and these guys are passing around trillions of dollars, which is our money, right? This is our currency. It's the American people's currency, right? It's got you know, it's got George Washington on these bills, right? And yet we can't know who the banks are. They're getting these massive amounts of money, which is in turn worth incredible. The Rothschilds years ago said it pretty well. It said, give me the power to coin the money, and I care not who makes the laws.
Exactly. Let me ask you this. You had Enron, you had WorldCom, you had all these companies, you even had your GM right now. They all received this money. They received the same type of money, because we talk about welfare, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But why is it that nobody wants to talk about the corporate welfare, which is just as dangerous, because you have these companies, as you stated, that if they know they're going to get bailed out by these banks, that they themselves can rob more of the people. We had several people who committed suicide because of the investments that they made to these companies went under, while the people who knew that the investments that were there were bad investments or falsified paperwork and books. And those people still got what they coined golden parachutes. How is it that we as a nation have seen all these things? We as a people have seen all these things, and yet we still do not hold our politicians accountable to address them every election cycle?
Because the narrative, because the discussion of this and the knowledge of this is controlled by a tiny elite who controls the American media. We have about 5 or 6 major media conglomerates that control over 90% of the media we get in this country, and they're tied in right in there with these bankers. A good example is I talked about this in my video on Goldman Sachs. You know, CNN, Goldman Sachs, and the Ziomatrix of power. And in that video, I discussed the fact that Goldman Sachs again is controlled, and they have links in government, and they have links in media. One of the biggest shareholders of Goldman Sachs, a perfect example of this, is Aviv Nevo. And Aviv Nevo was also one of the top shareholders of Time Warner, which is also one of the top shareholders of CNN. All this is intertwined. So we have an establishment media, we have an establishment banking institutions, we have and we have a political establishment that's totally dependent on this money. And we're going to see this obscene process this year, probably $1.5 billion spent in the Clinton campaign, and $1.5 billion in the presidential campaign. And I bet you, I really believe at this point that Donald Trump won't even have a third of that. And his contributions are coming from very different sources. Like I said, he got $19,000 from the hedge fund $19,000 from the hedge fund operations, and Clinton got $149 million so far from these international banking operations.
And these things aren't things that are out in the public that we're talking about. And ladies and gentlemen, we're live with Dr. David Duke, who has thrown his hat in the ring, and he's going to be running for Senate in Louisiana. These things are things that we do not talk about in the major media. Hillary Clinton was able to get away with a whole bunch of things. You talked about Donald Trump. Do you believe that Donald Trump makes more sense for America between the two because he's not as tied to the banks?
I think he's not tied to the bank. So you got to understand that he made his money, by the way, not by being a money manipulator, he made his money by building things, by creating hotels, companies, structures, refurbishing golf courses and resorts, whatever he's done. He's one of those kind of people that creates economy. He's created tens of thousands of real jobs. Goldman Sachs has created a bunch of jobs for a bunch of parasites who are feeding off of the people of this country. That's not the way Donald Trump is. But they hate him for a lot of reasons because he's called them out. He's talked to some of these big bankers. And he says, you're not going to give me money. He says, because you can't control me. And the only reason you give so much money to candidates is so you can control them. That's the kind of talk they don't like. Hillary Clinton got literally millions upon millions of dollars in her back pocket privately from people like Goldman Sachs. That's a fact, for giving about 3 or 4 hours of speeches. Now, nobody's going to go do business with Goldman Sachs because Hillary Clinton gave a little talk, a private talk to some of the Goldman Sachs bankers. This was a bribe. This was, and by the way, that's what special interest money is a bribe. I've been one candidate, and I'm proud to say that I've never taken a penny of special interest money or PAC money in my political races. My opponents have literally spent, I'm telling you, tens of millions of dollars from these PACs. That's another thing. We've got PACs. In addition to the control of the special interest direct contributions to candidates, you also have what you call PAC money. And PAC money totally controls American politics because that's the key to being president now. A PAC, you can give, first of all, if you try, Tommy, if you try to contribute to a candidate, if you try to contribute to me, for instance, for the U.S. Senate, and maybe some people out there watching this will want to contribute to my campaign. We need your support because I don't have any backing of the Goldman Sachs of the world, nor do I want it. But if you try to do that, you'd be limited to $5,700. That's what you're limited to do as an individual, right? But these people like Renaissance Technology, like one of the biggest supporters of Clinton, George Soros, millions of dollars, millions upon millions of dollars. And the interesting thing is that by law, the candidate is not supposed to be able to affect the PAC. So what does that really mean? That means that the PAC, they have the power. And so the candidate knows. In fact, let's say the PAC raises $100 million, and there's some of them like that, $100 million to get involved in the political process. Guess what happens? Guess what happens? They control that money. Now, they can put out commercials for that candidate, or they can put out commercials against that candidate. The candidate can't even control that. Now, believe that. So imagine if somebody is raising $100 million that they're going to spend for attack ads against your opponent, and they will have organizations that'll be spending millions of dollars against me here in the state of Louisiana. And we're going to be raising a few $100,000 in this race, maybe $1 million if we're lucky, but from small contributions, totally from small contributions. But if that happens, okay, those PACs can do whatever they want. And so if the candidate would dare to go against them, they can turn around and give the money to the opponent.
Now, let me ask you something. With the PACs having that kind of power, don't they kind of effectively write laws or affecting the laws very strongly?
Well, of course they affect the laws. And that's why we have these predator banks that rob us blind in this country. It's the greatest robbery in the history of the world. And you're right. I mean, there's no question about it. Now, listen, I'm not saying, I really believe there is a lot of welfare abuse. And I think the welfare system has not only been a crime against the hard-working person in this country, the person who works and pays taxes and pays a lot of taxes. I think it not only is it wrong for a person to live off of that when they could work and they don't, or be a lazy bum, or get messed up on drugs. I think there's a lot of abuse in the welfare system, but there's no question that the greatest theft in America is not from the welfare of a person who's poor or a needy person, or even a person that abuses the system. The greatest welfare abuse is from these international banks and from the policies that we have in this country for these special interests, like these incredibly insane wars that we've been fighting around the world, which have not been in America's interest. We shouldn't have been. I went to Syria. I met with the Christian leaders in Syria, and I met with Muslim leaders as well. And by the way, those Muslim leaders I met with in Syria are anti-Sharia law, and they're for the secular government. In fact, one of the leaders there in Syria literally was amazing. It was amazing, but he got up there and said, "We believe in freedom of speech." This is in the country of Syria, an overwhelmingly Muslim country. The government of Syria has a leader named Assad. As part of his cabinet, he had Sunni, he had Shiite, and he had Christians. He had Christian members of his cabinet. About 20% of his cabinet were Christians. There's 3 million Christians in Syria. And our government, this government of our country, which is overwhelmingly a Christian nation, we literally supported these jihadists who were cutting, and this has been going on for years now, who've been cutting off the heads of priests and nuns and murdering and raping Christian girls and Christian families. This has been going on a long, long time. We literally supported the rise of ISIS. And I tell you, Clinton has blood on her hands, not just for Benghazi, for the death of our ambassador, not just for this crazy war there, which hurt America and hurt our interests, but also for directly supporting these radical jihadist movements, which have now committed horrific terrorism in Europe, horrific terrorism in America. It's just unbelievable that we could do it. And again, they get away with it. I mean, the media should be absolutely raking her over the coals, which she deserves. She's the real murderer, by the way. She is the real, Trump hasn't killed anybody, right? She's killed a lot of people. And she's killed a lot of Christian people, by the way, and others, and Muslims. And I don't think anybody should be killed. And I also believe that our policy in the world, I believe that every people in the world have a right to control their own affairs. Now, if they want to go and sponsor terrorism against us or come and attack us, then we have every right to defend ourselves. But I do believe that as long as they don't bother us, that they have a right to create whatever government they want, whatever religious traditions they want and values. In fact, that's a basic human right. The problem is here in America, this is an overwhelming, and this is another real issue. And I know that African Americans are very conscious of this because it's been a white country for a long time, an overwhelming white majority. But America, what we call America, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our culture, our economy, our educational institutions, which created so many great things in this nation for all of our people, black and white for that matter, not just white people. This has been a product of European heritage and people. And I really do believe that in this country today, that European people are really facing a very bad situation. There's no people in the world that would just consciously or just stand by while they were basically wiped out in the nation that their forefathers created. And that's what's going on here. We have massive immigration that is purposefully, ethnically cleansing the European people from this country. And I really believe this, that I believe that the European people have given and made possible a lot of the opportunities and the educational opportunities and the values that black people have benefited from in this country. And I really believe that if we lose that European base of America, this European heart and soul of this country, I believe that we'll lose America and we'll become just like any other third world country where we go outside to go to the bathroom, you know, we live in a dirt floor and we have, you know, people beheaded. You know, they got more beheadings, I believe, in Mexico than they've had in the Middle East.
Well, let me ask you a question then.
Yeah.
Where is this coming down from? Because what we see is typically, like, say someone like me, we would see that the government is, quote unquote, a bunch of white males who are setting the laws, who may be setting themselves back. Are we not seeing the true hand? Are we not seeing the true Geppetto?
No, we're not. Yeah, most of Congress is what you call white males, but they are white males and white women who have sold out the interests of their own people. And that's the difference between me and these other elected officials and other people that talk out, is I'm telling the truth. I understand why black people have organizations that try to advance their interests and their culture, their heritage. You know, black people should be proud of their own people and their own heritage. They should also realize that the so-called Black revolutionary spirit, like the Black Lives Matter and these radicals that we have in this country, they're not really helping the Black community. And they're certainly hurting the whole community, both Black and white community, because the truth is that what Black people should be concerned about most is that not so much about what happens with the police when somebody does something wrong, somebody's criminal element. They should be concerned about maybe having a father present for that child. They should be concerned about not having their child on drugs and dope. They should be concerned about having morals and not having and not buying into a culture, a Hollywood, vicious, degenerate Hollywood culture that promotes drugs, alcohol abuse, gun culture. We've talked about this before, you know, like the Nicki Minaj thing. And I don't know whether the woman sings great or not. I don't listen to her music, but I know when I saw one video of hers, she had the F word about 89 times in it. She was talking about using cocaine, using drugs. She was talking about killing the guy that was trying to take her drug racket away from her. She was, I mean, just absolute degenerate.
Look, let's just be honest here, Dr. Duke.
Yeah.
Rap music is very, very violent. And if you have and it's actually aimed more towards young people than older people. And it's being done at a large scale for a purpose. You talked about something that I talk about a whole lot. So let's just jump into it. The two things, Black Lives Matter and fatherlessness in the Black community. You said that we should take pride of the Black community and what we've done and what we've accomplished. The sad part is that if a white person like yourself takes pride in white people and what they've accomplished, you become a racist. If a Black person like me accepts your premise and says everyone should be allowed to be proud of what they've done and their heritage, then I become an Uncle Tom or a coon. But let's talk about this whole idea of Black Lives Matter.
I do, and I've had, you know, a lot of my supporters, and I've had a lot of white people who are pretty angry, you know, about the Black Lives Matter movement, and justifiably so. And they're angry about the fact that a lot of it's not just Blacks who are victims of Black criminality. In terms of cross-racial crime, there's huge numbers of white people who suffered horrifically from Black criminality. And so they're angry, and I wanted them to also hear what's your point of view. So why don't you outline some of your position on this and how you think this is not contributing to the Black community or to the community at whole in this country?
Let's do it. All right.
Go ahead, please. I want my people who are, and my friends and our people to hear what some of your point of view is. It's very important.
Right. And I want to just preface this by saying, guys, no matter what it is you think about Dr. Duke and you bring up KKK or whatever it is, you see Dr. Duke sitting down and having a conversation with me. And every time we've talked, it's been a cordial conversation about the issues. Even when we disagree, we're having a discussion like this. And I just want some of your audience members to know, I just had to cancel a debate with a so-called pro-Black because in the process of going to visit the pro-Blacks and do the debate, my life was threatened. All types of negative things were coming from this. The reason I bring that up is because we have a country right now that if you do love America, you should be seeking more solutions than seeking these things that keep us apart. And if people are watching, what Dr. Duke and I are doing is trying to speak more on issues where we all can benefit. Black lives, white lives, every American. Because at a certain point in time, we should stand up and try to be American first. Now, to address what you're saying, I've heard people say that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. George Soros behind them, funding them. George Soros isn't Black, but he's funding those people to go out and make all these issues be about everything except the truth. They tried it in the DNC, all of these Black mothers out who were quote unquote the victims of these white cops brutalizing and murdering their Black sons. But when they trotted all those mothers out there, I want all of you people in the chat room and all of you people across the world listening, guess who they didn't trot out there? Fathers. There were no fathers there at all. So the Democratic National Convention, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and everyone associated with the left are trying to convince you that men, and in this case, black men, do not matter in their children's lives. But the one thing we can talk about that no one talks about is black people. Right now in America, the most violent places in America are the places where you dwell in the majority. And the places where you dwell in the majority are led by whom? Democrats. So you're voting for people who are continually keeping you in poverty and keeping you in danger. And the danger that you're in is not of cops, but it's of each other. Blacks in Chicago, blacks in all these inner cities are murdering each other at record pace, even though crime nationwide has gone down. So apparently that means white people's crimes have went down, even white on white crime, but black on black crime in black cities has gone up.
And black on white crime has gone up.
It's gone up as well. You're exactly right. And we don't want to talk about these issues. If a white person decides to say, these numbers say that I'm unsafe around this group of people, we call them racist. But I, as a black person, can say, I'm afraid of white cops. Well, the numbers aren't even close to the amount of damage and attacks and murder blacks have done to whites. It's not even close when you talk about what cops.
But it's microscopic compared to the other.
Yet it's okay for me to fear cops, but it's racist for a white person to fear blacks. Someone tell me if this makes any sense. And the reason I have such a problem, I'm going to let you jump in, Dr. Duke, in just a second. The reason I have such a problem with Black Lives Matter is because it doesn't address the issue, as I said, what happened in the DNC. They don't address the fact that all of those women were out there and all of those women were, they had children by men who weren't good candidates to be fathers in the first place and who weren't around. You have a woman who was there, Sandra Bland's mom. Sandra Bland called her mom asking for just $500 in order to get bailed out of jail. Her mother would not acquiesce. She would not give her the money. But when trotted out in the DNC, guess what she had on? A dress and a hairdo that cost more than $500. So I want you guys to think about this. Those white liberals were able to go out there and try to elicit black anger and white guilt. And the majority of liberals are doing that with the media. They want blacks to be angry and whites to be guilty. And no two people can work together when you have one side angry at the other and the other expected to pretend they don't see what the real problems are. So David Duke is not the problem. I'm not the problem. As a matter of fact, I want to talk to David Duke about that a little bit later. Professor Griff shouted out David Duke by pointing out he may not like a certain thing of what you talk about his background, but you can't deny he was right on a whole lot of issues. And as Americans, that's what the first thing we need to do is start listening to people when they are correct. Not where they came from, not what they said 20 years ago, but if you're right, you're right. And as Americans, the one thing we believe in is growth, because the older we get, the wiser we get. It should be that way. Black Lives Matter is, in essence, a terrorist group because it's pushing other black people to attack and go after things that are not the prevalent issues in their community. You will not hear liberals talk about fatherlessness. You will not hear them talk about black crime. And that should scare everyone. Go ahead, Dr. Duke.
Yes, it should scare everyone, and especially the black people, because there's no question that black people are suffering. But it's not because there's some sort of conspiracy of white people against them. There is, I believe, however, the only way I can describe it is, this sounds almost like a religious kind of designation, but I really believe the people who run the media in this country and the establishment in this country, I really believe they are, there's no other way I can describe it, they are evil. It is evil to aim thousands and thousands of movies toward young people, toward drug abuse and alcohol abuse and sexual degeneracy and violence and murder and blood and torture, which is now the average young kid, by the time they get 7 or 8, actually in 7th or 8th grade, they've seen 12,000, this is average, murders, violent, throat slittings, blood, horror, torture, by the time they're in 7th or 8th grade. This is what's going on. There's been a cultural change in this country and the values of our forefathers. And by the way, these are the values. When we talk about Western Christian civilization, we're talking about the values that were certainly brought here to this continent and created in this United States of America by Western white Christian people. Christians don't run the media. Europeans, people of European descent, don't run the media. Hollywood is not so white. In fact, and again, there are some Jews that act decently and some that don't, but it's not so white. It's by a non-European people that came from the Middle East who were very tightly knitted for their own interests. And sometimes those interests coincide with ours, and oftentimes they don't. But we have a media today. And I ask the black people watching your program, because you have a huge following, and you deserve that following. And I ask them to think about the fact, look at how they portray white people constantly in the movies. They're arguing about whether a black gets an Oscar or not. But my God, you have these movies like Django, where the black hero says, kill white people and get paid for it, or what's not to like. And then they bring him on Saturday Night Live, one of the leading cultural entities of the society. He gets on the stage, and the script writers, by the way, of this program, given these lines, and he says, man, you know, yeah, I got to start a movie where I got to kill all the white people. How great is that? And of course, the applause lights go on. Black Lives Matter ultimately is not responsible for this hatred. Black Lives Matter exists because we have a powerful global international media that runs this country that's inciting black people against white people in America, rather than addressing or getting black people to be concerned about the real damage to themselves and their families and the things that they love. And that is the drugs, that is the destruction of the family, the destruction of the morality that keeps a family together where you have a present father, this welfare dependency. I did a video today. I talked about the fact that since the war on poverty, we spent $20 trillion. I mean, it's an inconceivable amount of money. But guess what? Well, you know what, Tommy? We've got more poverty than we've ever had. We've got more criminality than we've ever had. We have more children born without a loving father and a good home than ever before. We have, you know, it's like, you know, this is a war on poverty. Well, we lost. We spent all this money, and we took that money from those people who were trying to do better in their lives, whether they be white or black people, to work and be responsible. We took that money, and we made it harder for people to succeed because of the burdens of taxes. We made it harder to have good educational systems. We made it harder to have a good infrastructure in our cities and towns because of this massive welfare underclass that these insane policies have promoted. We haven't helped black people. We certainly haven't helped white people. And what they've done is it's also a political mafia too, because what's going on is they're trying to incite black people because they're using black people as a weapon against the traditional European heritage in this country, because we've had a takeover of this country away from Western Christian values. And they're using them almost like shock troops against us. And the black bloc vote is what they use to overcome the opposition. And they also have this divide and conquer strategy. But they don't tell white people to defend themselves. You know, what they do is they get black people to hate us, and all the minority groups look at the terrible white people. But I tell you something, and I think you've traveled around, and I've traveled around the world. And I don't know anywhere in the world where black people have more opportunity than they have right here in this country.
Well, I've said that, and I think I get called a coon for saying that, or I get called all kinds of names just because I say if America was so bad, America does not withhold visas from black people. So black people could actually leave if they'd like to. So apparently they don't think it's better somewhere else. So if you don't think it's better somewhere else, wouldn't the next thing you'd want to do would be to try and work on the place where you are and work in a positive way? I made a video and I spoke about how you can hear a lot of people yell out they're from this city or that city, and they'll have pride in their so-called hood in America. But if you ask them if they love America, and they'll say F America, which is weird because your hood, your city is in America. So how can you love this piece of America, but not that piece of America? In order to become Americanized, the people have to put a stake into America. And I think a lot of American blacks right now don't have a stake in America. Meaning, if you give people a whole lot of things, if you let someone move in your house and you pay the rent and they don't, you pay the light bill and they don't, those people don't have a stake in how your house is run, how it looks, how the grass looks. And I think a lot of blacks, because they don't have a stake in America, they don't care about America. And when you have a section of people in your country, just like when a lot of the illegal immigrants come over, you have a lot of illegal immigrants who don't believe that they have to learn English, who don't believe that they have to value America, who will fly the flag of where they're from before they fly the flag of the place where they currently live and the place that puts a roof over their head and food in their mouth. We have to change this. Now, maybe it's not Trump, but we know it's not Hillary.
We sure know that.
Right.
Well, it's not Hillary, and it's not, you know, the Trump movement is really an anti-establishment movement.
Yes.
And I don't agree with everything about Trump, but I tell you, we could talk about some of those aspects because you wanted to talk some about the presidential race as well as my Senate race and what I think the issues are. But I really believe this, that Trump is truly the anti-war candidate. I think we have a lot less chance of going to get into a World War III with Donald Trump than we do with Hillary Clinton, who's been a major warmonger during her whole term. She was for the Iraq War. I was one of the American political figures who stood up very strongly against the Iraq War. I said it was a war based on lies, that it was going to hurt us. It was going to cost us trillions of dollars. And it has cost us trillions of dollars. This is money that could have solved some of our health issues. We could have paid off every student debt in this country. We got students who graduate from college, and they have a debt on their shoulders. They are like wage slaves for the rest of their life. And unlike a rich person who can declare bankruptcy after they've spent millions, right? They can declare bankruptcy and get a clean slate. A college student who is simply pursuing an education and gets a degree, they can't wipe off their debt when they don't have any money. And we have a government that sells them out because of HB1 visas, right? That we're letting people come in from other universities where they had free education in those countries, like in India or other nations. They can come in and take their jobs. Those companies can hire them at a lower wage. And so all these people that spent money in their education, that took loans out, they're sitting with this huge debt over their head they can never get rid of. I have a lady that works in my office, and she's an older person. She went to later education in her life. She couldn't get a job with the education, even though she did very, very well. It just wasn't available, probably because of some of the immigration policies. And she's sitting with about $100,000 of debt on her. She has to pay like a certain amount every month, and she's got to pay it because she can't declare bankruptcy. And she's only got she drives an old car, you know, back a 15-year-old car. And she can't even not pay that note, more or less, declare bankruptcy, because they'll come and take her car. I mean, we have a system in this society that's totally upside down. So we spend trillions on these wars. We spend trillions on this war on poverty, and we don't really give people the opportunity they need, both black and white, to achieve things in this country.
Yeah, and it's where we are as far as the politics. And I looked at the candidates before, and I remember when the Republican field was large, the Democratic field was basically basically two people, to be honest. And how we got there, nobody brought up the father issue. Nobody brought up the decline of morality. David Duke is running for Senate in Louisiana. Will David Duke bring up the decline of morality? Will he talk more about family values and make me proud as far as someone who is for fathers and men's rights?
Well, Tommy, let me ask you a question. Haven't I been talking about that for about the last hour?
Yes, you have.
Look, I've been talking about this for years, and I know the presentation of me by the media is so different. It's like a caricature. It's vicious, but you know what? I'm not ashamed of my past. I've never been violent. I've always condemned violence. I've stood up for what I think are the rights of my people, the heritage of my people. I saw the writing on the wall. I saw this massive immigration that was going to destroy the foundation of the country. I came to understand that when the people whose forefathers built America and the foundations of the things we value and love in America, when they become a tiny minority in this country and where they're replaced by people who despise America and who totally just disrespect our Constitution and our rights, how in the world is anybody going to benefit in this country, white or black? That's what's going on. I also believe, and I want to say, and I believe, and I've said this all the way along, I've always said that the best qualified person, black, white, yellow, red, whatever, should get the job or promotion according to their ability and their merit. That's what America is really all about. And that's what human rights are all about. And I think you know this as well. There is absolutely a massive institutionalized program in this country of racial discrimination against white Americans. And we're talking about 2/3 of the poor now, Tommy, because 2/3 of the actual poor in America are white. You know, that not 2/3 of the criminals aren't white, but 2/3 of the poor are white. The people really have poor circumstances in this country. And a lot of white people also come from broken homes. A lot of white people have suffered from diseases or difficulties in their life. And every one of the Fortune 500 companies has policies that hire less qualified non-European Americans over better qualified European Americans. Scholarships, educational. European Americans are still 65%. Often the Black Lives Matter movement says that if you have a town that's 65% black, then you should have 65% of the policemen black. That's one of their principles. Okay, well, we have a country that's still 65% white, and it's going down because of intentional policies. And we are actually 70% of the highest performing students, the high school students in the country, according to National Merit Scholarships. And we score 70% of the highest scores on preparatory exams and exams that showing your ability to perform in talents in college, which are absolutely accurate in terms of historical record. And yet we're now in the elite universities of America, European Americans are only 20% of those allowed in the Harvard and Yales and Princetons and Cornell's and the Ivy League and other major universities. We have a Tulane University in New Orleans. It's, you know, European Americans are a minority, and yet most of the qualified people in this state, the highest performing students, are European Americans. So I say that if racial discrimination is wrong against an African American or an Asian American or an Indian American or a Mexican American, I say it's just as wrong against a European American. And that's what's so odd, right? You can, every candidate, and to show you, if people, I know black people are probably saying, white people, they're on top, you know, they have white privilege and all that. Well, let me ask you a question. Isn't it interesting that every candidate for public office can say, in fact, they do, they go to the NAACP, they go to the Black Caucus, they go to Mexican organizations, La Raza, and they say, I want you to vote for me because I'm going to do this, 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 and this for the African-American people, or the Mexican-American people, or the Jewish lobbies, or the Israeli lobby in this country. I'm going to do this for you. I'm asking for your vote. You know, I love you. I appreciate you. So even Donald Trump can get up there at a rally, and if some black people raise up a sign, he said, look at that, these wonderful black African-Americans. I thank you, and I really thank all the African-Americans for supporting me. And if some Mexicans get up there, some of the ones that are not burning the American flag outside the venue, and they hold up a Donald Trump sign, Donald Trump can say, I really appreciate the Mexican Americans. I love the Mexican American people, and I really appreciate it. Now imagine for a second.
Like, you can't,
you know where I'm going. You know exactly where I'm going. It's so obvious.
Yep.
Donald Trump and no politician in this country could dare say, you know, and yes, I really think white people should vote for me because I represent your interests. That I love you and I appreciate you, and I'm going to fight for your interests. Yet they can do that, white or black. Now you tell me, I mean, if you want to know who controls the country, just find out who really you can't criticize, right?
Yeah, that's the quote that was allegedly attributed to Voltaire. But we don't.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Voltaire did it, but it's certainly a good quote. You know, if you want to find out, yeah, if you want to find out the really big don in a mafia organization, just find out the guy you can't say a word against. Then you're going to find out. But you know, But you can,
Well,
but aren't white Americans attacked constantly in our movies and represented evilly and racistly?
Well, let me stop you. It's not even white Americans. You're doing yourself a disservice. It's white males. White males are the one group that everyone can bash and they can't say anything in response.
You got it.
Remember, white females still get at you guys with feminists.
Yeah. And it's such a shame because, and the ironic thing is the hypocrisy of all this, because, you know, women are a lot of the victims of this process. I mean, and that's another point. Yeah, this is a very sensitive point, and I talked about this before on the show, and you probably looked into these figures. They're all out there. The Justice Department of our country has been led by black activists for the last 8 years under Obama. You had Eric Holder, and now you have Ms. Lynch. Under that department, they keep a data record of criminal predators and prey, so to speak, the victims and the predators, and they do it by race. Now, the reason why they do it by race, they do it's called the National Crime Survey. It's published by the U.S. Justice Department. It's compiled from all sorts of police departments, hospitals, all over the country, where you get an assessment of who's committing the crime, who's the victims of the crime, by race and by ethnicity and income and many other factors. But they do this by race, not because they're trying to discriminate against black people, but because they're trying to make sure black people aren't being victimized, right, by the white people. But the interesting thing is, I'm just give you a very fascinating statistic that I think that in a fact of life, that black people, I hope the black people watching this can kind of let this sink in a little bit. They maintain figures on rape, and they maintain the figures of the people who commit rape, and the race of the predator or the perpetrator and the victim. The interesting thing is, over the last 10 years, every year they have these facts and figures. Every 10 years, every year they compile these figures, and they compile how many white males raped or sexually assaulted black females. And Tommy, the figure is so low that it is zero statistically. I mean, literally less than 1% of black females are assaulted by white males. White females, this is amazing to think about now. White females, there's about between it varies year to year to a degree, between 25 and 35,000 white women every year are sexually assaulted by black males. That is a fact. You can look it up, the National Crime Survey, under Mr. Holder and Ms. Lynch. These are black activists. Now, imagine for a second if 30,000 black women were being sexually assaulted or raped by white males. If they're upset because a couple dozen black people with arrest records as long as their arm, murderers, robbers, drug dealers, gun offenses, they get upset because some of them are shot. I mean, what would the black people do if white men were doing that to black women? And it's just amazing to think about. And yet this happens in our country, and yet we're the ones that are presented like we're so evil, racist, because cross-racial crime is just unbelievably out of step. It's white people who are massively victims of being hurt, robbed, raped, assaulted by blacks, and it's not the other way around. So if it's evil for black criminals to be killed by some police, and it's not even necessarily race, then is it not evil for white people to suffer on a racial basis from minorities? I think it is evil. Yeah.
Let me say this. You're 100% not only correct, but I brought up the same argument, and maybe you can see if we see eye to eye on this as well. I said, if you take all of the racist white men in 2016 who have murdered black men and children, and you take all the racist cops, white cops who've murdered black men and children, and you add them up and you put it in this box. Now you take all of those beautiful black females, the Mother Earth, the beginning of civilization, and you name how many people, how many black men she's murdered in 2016, and how many black children she's murdered in 2016. That number far outweighs the number of racist white men and racist white cops. Yet there's no petition, no hashtag, no outrage on the fact that literally I did a story the other day where a black mother who had a teenage son who murdered someone over a stupid street argument, that black mother commissioned her nephew and a couple of other guys to murder teenagers who witnessed her son murder another person. The number got to 5 before she was caught. So 5 black teens were murdered, and this is nowhere near in the public eye. Why do you think she gets a pass while the minority, which is these racist white people, just run around killing black folks, when in essence, if you look at the number, it's almost non-existent? Yet why is that the forefront of the media, but the black woman is escaping?
Let me tell you why I think it is. This is a hard question, but I'd like to take a stab at answering that question. This is a very fundamental question. I don't think it's because the black people are responsible for not having this focus. I think this is a result of the people who run our establishment today. It's the establishment that constantly does this echo of black, victimization and black oppression and white racism and all these things. That's really what's changed. If you go back years ago, when you had much less of this in the black community, when you had much fewer blacks on dope, you had much fewer blacks who were in jail. Now you have huge numbers, much bigger numbers now. And that's one reason why the crime's gone down a little bit. It's because so many blacks are locked up in prison today. I mean, let's be frank about it. That's why this crime has gone down. It's not that there's less crime. It's just that we're locking up the criminals longer. And by the way, these activist organizations and the media and Hillary Clinton wants to let them all out of prison. And they want to take away our guns. So once we let all these predators out of prison, we're not going to be able to defend our own families. I mean, it's crazy. But so what's going on here? And I think the difference is that, and this is the fundamental thing. Now, this is what I was basically taught, but I learned from a black man I had a lot of respect for. And you know his name, and he's James Meredith. James Meredith was a young black man who got involved in the, quote, civil rights movement. He integrated Ole Miss. He was like a civil rights icon. But after being in the school for a while and after learning what's going on, he realized that this forced integration wasn't going to liberate black people. And what he realized was that when the black people have their own communities in cities like mine, the city of New Orleans, a very vibrant black community, where successful blacks stayed in the community, they made sure that things were safe for their children. They made sure their schools were better. They made sure that the drug dealers weren't operating on the streets. They cooperated with the police to make sure that happened. They had a good relationship with the people of the cities of this country. When that happened, you didn't have this massive horror that afflicting so many black people today, including so many innocent children. And you can't blame a child. You can't blame some little girl for being shot down on the steps of the project she lives in, right, by some gangbangers and stuff. So the difference is that, I believe that part of the answer for all races and all people is for people to have pride in themselves, that they take some responsibility in their own community, and I think that way of looking at things is what really helps people. And I think that's one of the reasons. You look at Harlem, for instance. Harlem has always had a degree of crime, certainly more crime than the white area, but it had much, much less crime back in the 1940s and 50s, not because the whites were over there beating them down, but because that was their community. And that was their little place. And because of that, the black leadership, instead of escaping to the white suburbs, they lived there, and they made sure the community they lived in was healthy for themselves and their children. I believe that, in a way, black empowerment, control over their own communities in a healthy way is good. But this cannot happen as long as we have a media that's trying to incite this massive hatred against white people. I lived in Baton Rouge. We had that terrible terrorist attack in Baton Rouge the other day, and I went to LSU. I was a student there. I did my undergraduate work there. And I also stayed on, and it was my first political race at the grand old age of 24, was for the state legislature in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so I've been there a long time. Then later I served in the legislature. So some of the best years of my life were in Baton Rouge. I probably met 400 or 500 police officers, most of them white, some of them black. And I tell you, a lot of those police officers I'm still friends with today. And then I'm driving down the street and I hear the news that this horrible attack on white police officers in Baton Rouge, a vicious, horrific attack. And I'm thinking to myself, is this America? I mean, what's happened to my country? And I was so worried about the fact that, well, I was worried about anybody, but I was worried about the fact that it was one of my good friends who I know their families and their wives and their children. And I was worried that they were, could have been some of the victims. And that's one of the things that made me decide to make this race, that I couldn't avoid this race. I knew it was going to be a lot of personal attacks on me. I knew the government was going to do whatever they could. I knew that the enemies in the Republican Party, Democratic Party would savage me. But I said, you know, we got to do something about this. This is not the right direction that America is going in. So I say the biggest problem we're facing is not, I don't think this is coming organically from the black community. I don't think that these black mothers, the overwhelming aspect of these crimes you're talking about have come because that's just the way they are. Because if you look back, when we had a Western Christian society in this country, that crime was 1/10 what it was now. You had those incidents sometime in the black community or the white community, but it was much, much smaller than today. I believe that this has come about because of the policies of our mass media. And by the way, I got some programs about the mass media that I got some answers to this. I believe it's time to break up the media conglomerates and have real freedom of speech in this country and stop this control, these unelected oligarchs in America. I think it's time, as I said, to elect our officials by their principles and their ideas and not by how much money they can have.
And not by what's in front of them either. I'm going to ask you a small question, then we'll jump to something else. We shouldn't vote because someone has an R or D beside them, but like you said, what they bring to the table and what they plan on doing. You went from the Democratic Party at one point to, where would you call yourself now? An independent? What would you call yourself?
I'm a Republican. But I'm a conservative. Well, I'll tell you what I really am fundamentally. I'm a constitutional, conservative Republican. And I'm a Republican who not only loves the conservative principles, but I understand that America as we know it cannot be saved, cannot be preserved unless we preserve the people who made it great to begin with. Donald Trump has a saying that we must make America great again. And we must make it great again. It's certainly not great right now, and it's falling. I mean, this country is, the most common thing I hear from people in a very crude way, they'll say, man, this country is going to hell. I mean, it's just, they go to these offices and it's just full of, I mean, it looks like some sort of third world banana republic when they go to get a driver's license or when they go to get their, pay their taxes or something. And they see the crime and they see the violence and they see kids going into schools and blowing away everybody. We always had guns. It's not guns that's creating this violence in the schools. In fact, when I was a kid, you could go buy a gun at 12 years old if you had the money. But nobody went into schools and blew people away. You know, I tell this story sometimes too. For 6 years, I went to a grade school, and that was in the late 50s. I'm telling my age now. But for 6 years, we went there, and I and all my friends, and there were at least 500 every day, 500 kids that rode their bicycles to school, parked their bicycles all day long, and drove their bicycles home. And in 6 years at that school, there was not one kid that had a single bicycle lock on their bicycles. And there was not one bicycle in that 6-year period that got stolen. That is a different America. What happened? It's not that the American people are so different. It's the fact that the people who control our culture and our values, they're not a Christian valued society. They're not a value society of the founders of this country. And that's what I think has changed. And I think anybody with an open mind and it really examines this will understand that.
Well, you have to understand too, they're not teaching us to have the type of dialogue that you and I are having. They're teaching the young people that, like you said, number one, white people are bad. So whatever you do to them, the first question someone will bring up was, well, there's poverty to the black person, his surroundings. but you've never heard someone, and I want you guys out there, no matter if you think I'm a coon or he's a racist or whatever, answer this question honestly. Have you ever seen a crime perpetrated against a black person by a white person, and the media started asking you about how he grew up? Did the media start giving him a pass or her a pass because she was broke, because she didn't have a father, because of what had happened to her when she was 8 due to the hands of some black people? You will never see this happen in the media. You have to ask why, because the other way around, as soon as a black person kills a white person, they're going to ask. They're going to say, well, it must have been because he's broke. They're going to say he didn't have a father. They're going to say it was because of whatever. They're going to find a reason to why the crime isn't that bad. And you have to think as a person, why are they pushing these two groups against each other like this? Because you can't continue to do harm against one group and not expect them to fight back. So eventually the white man will be forced with a thought of, if you laugh when white cops are shot in Dallas because you believe something happened in Louisiana, then what do you think the white cops or the white people are going to do eventually when they're pushed too far? And
I said earlier, and what you said earlier, if you don't mind me jumping in for a moment, what you said earlier is so true. What you're saying is that not only are these programs bad for white people, they're bad for black people too. One of those police officers shot to death in Baton Rouge was a black guy.
Yep.
Right? You know, it's like, here's the issue in my mind. Here's a good example. I believe that what's happening now, I think the black people are being used. They're being used as cannon fodder, basically, for the people that are supporting these movements, like George Soros, who's basically a Marxist leftist. And it's kind of always interesting to find these Marxist Bolsheviks who are capitalist bankers. Isn't that interesting? Because they're supposed to be the dichotomy, right? Why is it that all these richest hedge fund capitalist bankers are all promoting Marxist policies? I mean, it's just insane, but that's what's going on. But you look at what they're doing. I mean, they are absolutely promoting this violence. Now, look at the way the media, again, I say the media is controlled. You're an independent media. And that's one reason why I'm on with you. I get lots of offers to go on media. I'd rather go on the Tommy Sotomayor show because we can talk here. We can talk honestly and frankly, and we can tell the truth to each other, and we can tell the truth to the audience. And some people won't like what I say, and some people won't like what you say, but at least we have freedom of speech here. At least we have freedom of conscience here, freedom of thought, and that's the only way to get to the core of any issue. And I think if people understand what I say, if they hear me for themselves, they'll judge me very differently than this caricature of the media they do. But let's take a look at let's take a look at what happened, not just in Baton Rouge. Let's go to Dallas. 11 police officers shot. Now, the guy that did this said, even while the policeman had him, you know, under negotiation right there, he said, I want to kill all the white people, and I want to kill white police officers. Specifically said this, right? And he shot 11 police officers. So did you notice? I noticed, because I'm noticing these things. I see these things. I didn't see one headline, black racist shoots police officers. Not one headline, not even one headline, black man kills police officers. When Trayvon Martin died, when this guy Brown died, of course, in Ferguson, the headlines all over the place were white officer shoots unarmed teen. Doesn't matter whether the guy was a mountain of a guy and he has DNA all over the gun, and they had DNA all over the throat of the police officer, and trying to get to his gun and shoot him. Doesn't matter. I mean, that's what the headlines were. Now, you didn't see, you can look, I just challenge those people listening. If you don't believe what I'm saying and don't see what I'm seeing, go look at the headlines and just go see if you can find one headline that says, you know, black racist or black man, makes a massive massacres police officers. If it had been a white police officer who said, I wanted to go kill black people, do you think it wouldn't have said white officer or white policeman shoots down, black people? Obviously. So what's going on, Tommy? Is this a fair media, or is the media trying to create a narrative for their own political purposes? The
media is pushing one side that they know eventually is going to have to push, that is going to push back. They're
And
doing
it's
it.
sad because we're going to be the victims of all this, black people and white people.
Yep.
I believe that white people and black people can try to work out our differences, and however we decide to do that between ourselves, without the influence of the media, we can find ways that's good for all people. Now, I'm a white person, and I love my heritage. I love my culture. I want my kids and grandkids and great-grandkids and further on to have the same heritage as mine, like all people do in the world. And so I want to preserve my white culture. I understand fully, and I embrace the idea that a lot of black people want the same thing. By the way, Muhammad Ali, you know about all that. I know you know about this. Mm-hmm. Muhammad Ali is called such a great man by the media, and yet Muhammad Ali had the same views of preserving his heritage about race and his ancestry the same as I do. Exactly the same.
It's okay for a black person to say, I only date black people. It's okay for a black man to say, I'll only marry black women. But if a white man says, I only date white women, he's racist. If a white woman says, I only date white women, she's racist.
That's right. So the hypocrisy is amazing. And I do believe that, I want to preserve my people. And in fact, I believe, I'm also an ecologist, and I believe in, saving all life forms on the planet. I want to preserve the speciation of this planet and the diversity of life on the planet. And what is more important than preserving the diversity of mankind? The one thing, the people of your ancestry, the African ancestry, they have the highest birth rate in the world in Africa. They have there's going to be 2.5 billion more black Africans by the turn of, in fact, by the middle of this century. That's not far away. 2.5 billion more. There's only 800 million white people in all of Europe, and they're headed for Europe, right? In Europe and America, there are more white people dying than are being born. And the government has all these policies and programs that kind of lessen our birth rate. The government's also producing and promoting a lot of these gay marriages and the increase of homosexuality, which also lowers the birth rate. And, if I don't care what people do in the privacy of their own home, but I tell you something, if this is such a natural and healthy institution, then any species, any higher mammalian species that practice this, they wouldn't even be existing.
Yep. That's right.
I mean, think about that for a second. I say we have a right to exist. And I say that I love the character. I'll be frank about it. I love my people. That doesn't mean I don't respect other people. And that doesn't mean that I can recognize the beauty in other people or the positive things about other people and the talents that they might possess and their abilities they may possess in certain areas of life, whether it be in physical endeavor or athletic endeavor or spiritual endeavor or the ability to sing or whatever they might do. But I want to preserve my people. I think that's the most natural thing in the world. Not because I hate others. I certainly don't want to oppress anybody, but I believe that I've got the right and our people have the right to exist. And I believe the people who are running this country are purposefully ethnically cleansing European Americans from the nation that our forefathers created. That's a lot to say in a few words, but it says a lot. And that's exactly what's been going on. When I was 18 years old at LSU as a young student, I got up at something called Free Speech Alley, and I said, the 1965 immigration bill is going to eventually make white people a tiny minority in America, and this will totally change our politics. And the idea that a former communist, now I'm talking about an open former communist, Socialist Workers' Party, Bernie Sanders, would be winning primaries in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party just in 1972 was on the way to electing George Wallace as a Democratic nominee in all those. Now we have a person who's a communist. Communism has killed more people than any other ideology in the history of the world. And by the way, Bernie Sanders is never identified as former communist Bernie Sanders. He was also a former Stalinist all the time back when he was at an Israeli kibbutz in Israel. He had a red flag in his office in Burlington, Vermont. Under the red flag, tens of millions of people, including tens of millions of Christians, were massacred under that symbol. But the media makes no difference about that because the media is controlled by the same people who supported those Marxist movements around the world. And that's the reality of life in this country, and it's something we've got to face up to. I urge people to read my book, The Secret Behind Communism, and I talk about that subject a lot.
I want to ask you a question, because we as Americans, one of the groups of people who we're trying to figure out where they fall in this political season are the veterans. Our veterans who went out and fought for the so-called freedoms that we have here in the United States. Where's your stance on the current treatment of the veterans? The fact that they're having a hard time getting their benefits in a lot of cases. They were having a hard time getting mental treatments. They were being mistreated in a lot of areas, and a lot of them are poor and without homes and literally just cast aside. What is it? How is it that you feel about the military, and what would you try to bring in the Senate to help some of the military people? Mark Burchett wanted to know about that. He's in the chat room.
Well, I tell you, I think that we couldn't do too much for those veterans, especially for those veterans that we sent into battle, into war, basically for wars based on lies. I mean, any man that would stand up and fight for his country and risk getting his legs blown off, being blinded, being even emasculated, losing even this power to have children, and suffering for this country, we have an absolute obligation to them, and we're not doing it. Trump is absolutely right about that. So I wouldn't tolerate that, and I think it's one of those symptoms of how far America has fallen. We talked about this earlier. You know, we used to have the best educational system in the entire world, one of the very best. And now we have a system that millions and millions of Americans, we can't even use the public educational system that our own taxes pay for. Not simply because of the educational mediocrity, in fact, the educational disaster that they are, but even because we know we send our children there, they're not going to be educated in the sciences and the higher aspects of learning. They're going to be educated in maybe how to use dope and drugs and gang sex. I mean, my God, it's unbelievable what's happening in this country. We are losing this country fundamentally. Now, some people will say, like the Donald Trump speech at the Republican convention, this is too pessimistic. You know, you can't solve problems without confronting them. If you just say, you know, you got roaches taking over your house and you say, oh, everything's great. You know, everything's great. Oh, we got a few little things crawling around a little bit. There's no problem, you know. No, we have to confront the problems. And that's the only way we can make things better. And we do have to make America great again. And what I say, and this is controversial, it's called racist, but I don't think it is. It's just fundamental, because every people create a society that reflects their own soul and spirit. We're not going to be able to make America great again unless we preserve the rights and the heritage of the people that made America great in the first place. And that's my fundamental belief. I know that African Americans stand up for what they see as their interest, their heritage, their traditions, their values, the interests of their people. I know that Mexican Americans do that. I know that all over the world, every people, wherever you go, they stand up for that. I've lectured all over the world. I lectured in Mexico a while back at a conference with academics all over South America. I've lectured in the Middle East. I've lectured in Europe. I've lectured in Asia. And every people want to preserve their heritage. The ironic thing is we've got such a controlled media in America that they tell European Americans, white people in this country, that if you want to preserve your heritage in America, that you're some sort of evil, racist bastard. And I don't go along with that. I think every people has a right to live, and our people have the same right. And I believe, Tommy, that your people have the right to live. And I believe that if I'm elected senator, I'll be a senator who will respect the rights of all people, the freedom of all people, and I also defend the rights of my own people, that we will not be discriminated against, and that we will be able to preserve our existence in this country and have a decent life for ourselves and our children and the future of our children in this society.
Can you tell me what you'd like to see done for the veterans? Again, they want to be a little bit specific. What would you like to see done for them if you were able to get in and talk with the other senators and try to put a bill on the floor?
Well, if we can treat illegal aliens, and we can treat people who abuse the welfare system in any hospital in America. Because if you go in with a crisis to any hospital, they got to treat you, and the taxpayer picks up the bill. I think the same principle has to be for veterans. I would suggest that we do have some institutions specifically for veterans and veterans' needs. That's good. But I think what we have to do is simply make any veteran, especially any veteran that's ever endured injury or suffered for our country, for our people, I think they should be able to be treated in any hospital, and they're going to be taken care of. If we can't take care of our veterans, then we can't take care of anybody in this country, and we don't even have the right to call us a country anymore. It's not a country anymore when you don't respect those people who made the greatest sacrifices for the country.
Nice. Education. Where does David Duke stand on education? Because as you know, and especially in the South, with Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, a lot of us having some of the lowest literacy rates, graduation rates from just high school. What would you like to tackle on education? Because if you notice, a lot of this miseducation or no education is causing the problems where the government is able to run over the people, because the people aren't even knowledgeable of a lot of things going on. Most people will only vote for the president because it's like American Idol, but they will not vote for their senator, their governor, their mayors, these things right here. So how would you address education as senator?
Well, we got to look at the fundamental things first. And the first way to address education is to address the values that our young people grew up with. And that's what we're not doing. In fact, that's the opposite. And I want to make a point to you that the truth is, if you look at the facts, our high school graduates are more illiterate today. And even though we spend more money in this country in education than any other country in the world, and we're supposed to have all these new techniques and all this technology, our high school graduates are less literate and less capable in the basic tasks of math and reading and understanding and comprehension and all these things than they were way back in the 1950s when all those vicious old white racists were running things, you know? I mean, yeah, and that's true among blacks too. Even black education actually did better among blacks than it's doing today. So what's going on? The way you begin that is we need a media in this country, a movie industry in this country, and a psychological structure in this country where we teach people, young people, about honor, duty, honesty, courage, hard work. We've got to teach them good values. You're not going to, if you teach black kids, and that's what every school does it today, where you just go into this big victimization thing, where the black kid is taught that, well, if you don't do well on the test, it's because of those white people. It's because of racism. It's because of slavery. My God, you know, there's been a lot of white slaves in history. You know that. I mean, we got to know that. Slavery existed all over the world in every country. It wasn't just a European thing. It would be kind of stupid. No white kid is going to go around and say, well, you know, I failed the test because my ancestors in Slovenia are in the Slavic countries, which is a word for slave, were slaves a few hundred years ago. And when black people and black kids are taught that, what does it do in terms of their willingness to take responsibility in their own lives? And the same thing is true about young people. We teach kids, we try to teach kids, you know, reading and writing, arithmetic, and the rest of it. But you know what? We don't teach kids the right values now. I think we got to teach them really and truly morality, honor and duty and courage, and also responsibility. And we also have to have discipline for our kids, frankly. If you cannot and you don't discipline a child, you're not helping that child. You're actually destroying the future of that child.
Let me ask you this. Where does your stance on school choice? And let me give you an example. My daughter goes to a private school, but she could be homeschooled. What do you think about the families having a better choice? I believe more of a community schooling, that I believe if the teachers were all a part of the communities, the neighborhoods, and they taught their children in each neighborhood instead of this state-run, we're sending these children who live over here to that school over there, because I think that's hurt more than it's helped. What do you think about parents having the choice to be able to use whatever money that they put into the government to either use on homeschooling, private school, or the schooling of their choice?
Well, I'm all for that. But the only way we can do that, because this is what I'm afraid of, and I'm sure you would be afraid of this too. You know how the government messes up everything. And if we get to a point where you have vouchers and you take it to a private school, the government will begin to dictate, right, what they teach, how they teach it, and they'll destroy whatever exists in those schools. The proper way to do this is simply a tax credit. And I have a plan. I've been advancing this for the last 30 years, in my political career. Way back in 1989, I proposed this. In fact, I was in the Health and Welfare Committee, and I also did a lot of work in the educational area. This is what I believe. I believe in what's called a tax credit. Everybody pays taxes, and a great proportion of your taxes, especially locally, go to the cost of public education. In most communities around the country, that's probably the biggest single expenditure on a county level or a city level is your education, as well as, of course, sanitation, things like that, but education. So what we do is we don't have to, if we give people 100% tax credit, what happens there is basically you're going to pull so many kids out of public education. What's left in public education for those who can't afford private schools is just going to be absolutely disastrous. So I think we should have strong public education, but I have a way that public education can be benefited and private or church school education or homeschool education can be benefited too. I believe in what's called a half tax credit. In other words, let's say in a community it costs $12,000 to educate a child. All right, I say that you give people a credit in terms of the taxes they pay, where they get a half credit. So for instance, they'll get $6,000 if their child's taken out of public school. Now, what does that do? First off, the government, the school system saves money, right? Yes. They still have half the money, but they don't have the child. So they have smaller classes. They got more money to spend, right, on each student, more money to pay teachers, actually, per student in those institutions. At the same time, the individuals that want to send their child to a church school or a private school will have $6,000 more expendable income because they're tax credits to send their child to a private school. Nowadays, most places in America, private schools kind of start at $10,000 a year. If they could get $5,000 or $6,000 help to take their child out of public school to private school, it'll help the public school because they'll be getting more money with less students, more money per student, and it'll help the private schools because, man, it makes a lot of difference if you can pay $4,000 a year for your private education for your child as compared to $6,000. Doesn't that kind of make there's so many simple solutions and benefits. But if we do a voucher system, the danger is the government will come in and control it. So it's just got to be a system that once the child is in private education, that the parents get some sort of a tax break for their kids.
Yeah, and I love it. I love talking. We're getting to the meat of it, and ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap it up here soon with Dr. David Duke, who is running for Senate, Louisiana. Yep. And make sure they know the website where they can go to help you in your quest for Senate.
Yes, that's right. My website is Duke for Senate. That's not the number 4, but the letter 4, F-O-R, dukeforsenate.com. And I really would ask all of your people out there that think I'm making sense here and that I have good policies, that we need at least one man in the Senate that will stand up to the international bankers, who will work to reform the entire political system in this country. In fact, we should talk about that next, who will really stand up for the principal values of this country, stop this massive immigration, and also certainly make sure that we don't get involved in all these crazy wars overseas. I mean, this is what's led to ISIS. This is what I warned about years ago. So if you want to help me, I need your help. In fact, in Louisiana, I've done very well in the polls. Just recently, there was a poll by UNO, and all day the media so much hates me. They hate me. I think they hate me. I know even more than they hate Donald Trump. So I think that's a good thing. I think the more the media hates you, the better you are in our political society today. But they did a poll, and they said that Duke has very high negatives. He's not really liked much by the voters. Very high negative ratings. Well, I think the same thing was said. Think back Tommy, 4 or 5 months ago, talking about Donald Trump's the highest negatives of any candidate for president in our history. And yet look at him now. They also, in the course of the survey, which was done by the University of New Orleans, again, they showed that 14% of the people responded saying they were going to vote for me. And I fly under radar because when they said, they don't know who's calling them. In fact, these are robocalls. They don't want to talk to somebody and tell them, because in this country, we're so politically correct. Some people would be worried about losing their job if they found out they were supporting me. In fact, some people in this country have lost their job because they had a Trump bumper sticker in the back of their car. So people don't want to say, that's why our founding fathers very intelligently said that we must have a secret ballot, that we can go behind the voting booth and nobody has the right to know who you're voting for. And they exercise that privacy every time a pollster calls them and they don't tell them that they're for David Duke. I get double every time. So if I got 14%, that's 28% or 30%, because I get more than double in almost every one of my races. In this particular poll, though, so they admitted, again, that 14%, which should be 28%, that says I'm running first. But listen to this. These people are so vicious against the true American political system and the true freedom of this country, that they do everything hook and crook to silence people who go against the establishment. And what they're talking about now is they're saying, and I'm kind of like Donald Trump, except on a lower scale, except I don't have money he's got. But I don't need a lot of money to run. It's like programs like this. If people get a chance to listen to me or in debates, I win. It's simple as that. So the important thing is that now they're trying to say, and they're trying to make this requirement, that if you're running in the Senate race, to get into debates, you have to raise a certain amount of money. They're trying to make a threshold of about $200,000. So, and they're probably going to raise that. So we're putting on a fundraiser right now to raise $250,000. I'm not getting any money from Goldman Sachs. I'm only responsible to you. And I can tell people in Louisiana, I'll be the best senator you ever had. But you know what? I will be not only a senator for the people of my state, and I'll fight for my state, but I'm also going to be a senator for millions and millions of people all over this country who don't really feel like they have a voice in Washington, D.C. I'll be the only one who will defend the heritage of rights of my people, the way that almost every black politician openly defends his rights, the way that almost every white politician says he's going to fight for the rights of Mexican Americans. I'll be the only one who will respect all races and the equal rights of all races, but also I will make sure that European Americans have that heritage. So I urge you, if you like what I've been saying today, and if you find the strength of it, the honesty of it, and the sense of it, that you go to my website, Duke for Senate, right now, and make a contribution. It may be the most important campaign donation or contribution you've ever made in your life, because this is the first election. This election may have more impact on the American political process and whether or not we save our rights and heritage in this country than any other, maybe in our history. If you can send me as your spokesman, as a man who's going to stand up to your issues to the United States Senate, every day I'll be like that canary in the mine warning about the poison gas that's going on in government. And there's a lot of it. In fact, I think I might have to, what I think I'll do when I come on my first day, I think I'll bring a gas mask along with me. But no, I'm going to be there, and I'm going to stand up for you, wherever you are. If you believe in true equal rights, if you also believe in preserving the heritage of this country and a decent society for all of us, then please not only vote for me if you can in Louisiana, but wherever you are, in a sense, if you can support me. And I'm not asking for incredibly powerful contributions. I don't want any special interest money. I won't take any. I've never taken opinion PAC money in my whole political career. But you can affect this election, at least give me a chance to give this message out by sending me a few dollars. Some of you can give a maximum contribution. Some of you can give $10, whatever. I'd appreciate if all of you who are listening who like this and are inspired by this and you're motivated by this to go to my website, even while we're still on the air right now, to Duke for Senate, and go to donate and give me a hand in changing this country for the better, and maybe changing this world for the better.
I like it. Well, Dr. Duke, here's the thing. I'm going to ask you a question, and how you answer this question is going to dictate if we remain friends after this or not. Okay. And it's something that's very near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
And it's the whole child support issue, welfare issue, and father's issue. How would you deal with what seems to be a broken welfare system that is hell-bent on rewarding women for having children in the worst situations possible, never holding them accountable? They can have 5, 6, 8, 10, because as you know, if a man has a bunch of kids he can't take care of, they put him in the state. If a woman has a bunch of kids that she can't take care of, she gets help from the state. Different results, the same behavior that is detrimental to that community. Men need a voice. Children need a voice. And that voice comes in the form of family. And each one of those people, the men and the children, are being denied the voice of a family by the state coming in and overcompensating women. And I have deemed and termed a lot of these women called sponsored terrorists. They're being put in positions by the government to be compensated for putting children in these wrong situations, horrible situations, impoverished situations. What will you do to address men and children's concerns and struggles when it comes to the child support and family courts?
I think it's a great question, and it's a lot of facets to it. So it's going to take me a little while to go into all the areas, but I think, first of all, let's start from the root. The root is women have children, and there is a special relationship between a mother and her baby, especially in the earliest part of life. But acknowledging that fact, we also must understand that there's no inherent necessity of truth that a mother is going to take care of that child better as that child begins to grow than a father. In fact, there are a lot of mothers who have custody and have these arrangements that are done by the courts that are obviously worse parents than the father would be, but simply because they're a woman, they're given this. And that's an example of the kind of society we live in. The important thing that I believe in this society in terms of how we treat and we deal with people is the merit of that individual. And that's how things should be decided between a man and a woman. A woman shouldn't get custody of a child because she's a woman. The person best qualified to take care of that child, the person who's acting more responsibly in their life. There's a lot of women in this country that are drug addicts. There's a lot of women in this country that are alcoholics. There's a lot of women in this country that are behaving themselves in horrific ways, as there are a lot of men in this country that do that. We have to have a fair and just system. Amen. We also have to have a system that there's a responsibility from this massive, illegitimate welfare type birth rate that we have going on in this country. Now, this is the most controversial part of my career. I served in the health and welfare department. I interviewed, hundreds of welfare recipients. I interviewed psychologists on this problem. And one of the main points that I said, and it's exactly what you were talking about a minute ago, and I've been talking about this, Tommy, probably not from before you were born, but probably from the time you were a wee child, okay? Here's the situation. The reason why that poverty has expanded since we spent $20 trillion more is because we have a welfare system that finances an illegitimate welfare birth rate that gives a financial incentive, in a sense, to a woman to behave irresponsibly.
Amen.
Now, it's true that a child will probably cost more than the additional benefits of more food stamps or a bigger apartment or more welfare money. A lot of places have welfare per child. But that's not what the welfare recipient, the habitual, chronic welfare recipient who's never really worked in their lives, that's not what they see. All they see is the bigger check. All they see is the more food stamps. All they see is the bigger housing allocation. all they see is the bigger Section 8 housing opportunities for them, the grants by the government. The truth is that every time especially an illiterate or a poor educated or any woman has a child without a loving present father, it lessens the opportunities for those children being born as compared to someone that lived in a healthy relationship. It also lessens the opportunity for that person to escape the cycle of poverty. So these kids are born in this ridiculous environment. They often are abused. Often their mothers have abuse problems. We even have, as you know, and this is one of the most tragic and horrible things I can even think of. It's a horrible subject to even discuss that this would go on in this country. But we literally have hundreds of thousands of babies born in this country still today that are what you call crack babies. Mm-hmm. Now we even have meth babies born today, and they're and babies born from women on heroin. That literally the fetus, the child himself is affected, his brain's affected, his body is affected, and many of these children will never grow up to be a fully functioning, healthy, and happy human being. This has got to stop. We have got to encourage welfare recipients, these mothers, from a very young age, as soon as they start to qualify, as soon as they get old enough and they're looking for assistance. We need to have them have counselors and have people talk to them. And either we encourage them to be moral, so to speak, to wait for marriage, which may be impossible. But the least thing we should do is they should be responsible. We have married couples right now, millions of married couples in this country who'd love to have kids, but they don't have kids because they can't afford it. And they don't want to bring kids in the world where they can't provide for them adequately and properly and give them a good life. Certainly, shouldn't we encourage welfare mothers, welfare recipients, shouldn't we encourage them to practice some sort of birth control? Shouldn't we encourage them to be more, if they can't be moral anyway? And that in turn gives them more options. And what I suggest, and this is one of the bills I suggested in the House of Representatives in Louisiana, I suggest that we literally give them incentives. And if they don't get pregnant, and we're not talking about abortion because I'm anti-abortion really, but if they don't get pregnant and they so they don't become a bigger burden on society. And by the way, a lot of these babies born, these crack babies, they can cost $300,000 per child, just the medical attention. And then that child still doesn't ever really make it very well. So that money, what about the healthy kids who need support? So the real way to slow down the rising welfare underclass in this country is to slow down the illegitimate welfare birth rate. And so we should start counseling them, and we should start giving them certain incentives.
How about this?
Yeah.
I want you to, whenever this comes up, I want you to call me and let me write, because I'll write you a great list of when we get to the Senate. Here's one thing.
I'm anxious for that. I'll tell you what, when I go to the Senate, I'll invite you up to DC, and we'll sit down and I'll listen to every one of your suggestions, and I'll also have my staff do it. We'll research it all. And those that I like, and I know there'll be some that I like, we'll present in a bill form. And then we'll make the Senate take a position on these things.
Yeah, let's throw this one out there. Why is it that we don't have something that states there's a cap on children out of wedlock that the United States of America, the government, the people who pay taxes, will foot the bill for? After the first child you have, while already being on welfare, that second and third one you cannot apply, we won't help. That's the kind of punishment that would actually make an individual not feel like, well, if I had a second kid, I'd feel I get more money. Because remember, a lot of these women are thinking that way. Well, if I get this much for one, why not have a second? There is no detriment. There's no deterrent to not having the second one. I think that would be something that, what about children out of wedlock? We don't talk about this idea of, if you didn't go in front of the state in order to get your marriage license, why are you asking the state now to turn around and foot the bill? That would change the mindset of people, as you said, the morality.
Sure. Of course. I mean, that only makes sense to say look, here's what will happen. We think that's hard, and you say, well, it's hard because you're not giving additional benefits for the child. The real hardness is having kids being born into a society and into those environments who ended up later becoming criminals, hurting innocent people, who becoming a tremendous drag on other people. It's not helping those kids. You're hurting those kids if they're encouraged to be born in a very bad environment, in the continuing environment like that. Look, let me give you some practical things. One thing I advanced, and one thing I said, and I had a bill before the Health and Welfare Committee and the House of Representatives, was that every welfare recipient, before they get their first dollar, they must agree to either abstain in a Christian sense, or they have to promise, make a commitment, sign a contract to practice birth control of their choice. So doesn't that make sense that if you have a person that's not married, that is on the welfare system, that while they're on that welfare system, that they don't have another child without a present father to burden themselves and their future and their society? Doesn't that make just common good sense for them? And doesn't that lessen the suffering of children? And the fewer children, obviously, that are born in these situations without a present father, in these horrific environments, often drug use and violence and abuse and all these things, isn't that going to give us more funds for education processes, training processes to help the kids and help the parents who are in that poverty situation? Doesn't that just make good sense?
Man, these kind of discussions seem like they would be common sense and logic, and it seems like we're not having them. We're not having them in a key position. The key people aren't bringing them up. Again, we go back to the DNC. They train all these women out here saying how bad the situation was for them after their children died, but no one pointed out that each and every one of those children were born in impoverished situations to mothers who did not do what was best for those children. And the first thing that any mother, if you listen to me, women, the first and most important thing you can do for your child is pick a good father.
That's right. The choice you make about who you want to live with in your life and who you love and who you make a family with is one of the most important choices you make. And the way our media teaches us is that it's not even a choice. It's just something you fall into.
Exactly.
It's crazy, isn't it? And of course, nowadays they're teaching our young kids. I mean, almost every movie for young people literally teaches young girls and young guys to drink yourself into oblivion. Tommy, we have 25,000 kids, basically young teenagers and young people a year who die, not from the effects of alcoholism or drinking for a long period of time, from drinking so much in a short period of time that it kills them. They have alcohol poisoning. And in addition to 25,000 that die, you have probably 150,000, 200,000 that have brain injuries to their organs, which will last a lifetime. But how many movies? You've seen them. I've seen them. I've seen this 50 times in the films and even television shows where they show young people, and it's really cool. They all do the drinking games where they drink themselves to oblivion. And really, the coolest kid is the person, or the coolest young person is the person that drinks the most shots of the strongest alcohol you imagine.
Yeah.
Now, any parent, you have a young daughter. I mean, any decent parent's nightmare would be the idea of having a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old daughter that drinks themselves into oblivion with a bunch of high testosterone teenage guys around there, right? I mean, and yet this is what is presented and promoted by this, and I'll say it again, this evil media that is degrading humanity, not ennobling humanity. And we've got to change it. I want to pass antitrust legislations. I want to break up the media conglomerates. I want to absolutely promote independent producers, filmmakers like yourself and your program. I want to see a flowering of the best values in this country. I know that the people who control the organized globalist media are a bunch of, excuse the French, but a bunch of evil bastards who are leading this world, our countries, to disaster. That's why we have kids going into buildings and blowing away their classmates or shooting people, because that is the culture that they present them. That's what they're taught. They're also taught that if they hate somebody or they think somebody's evil, they got the right to do anything to them. We didn't used to teach that. We used to have movies like Who Shot Liberty Valance or something, where the sheriff is dealing with a really bad guy, right? And the people come out to lynch him, but the sheriff makes sure he gets a fair trial. Sometimes the sheriff will die trying to protect the guy, because everybody gets their day in court. Today we have a morality basically that if you, and you see it in 1,000 programs where police officers, this is presented the way police officers are supposed to act. I think most police officers don't do this, thank God. But also secret agents and everything. They'll torture, they'll gouge the eyes out of people. And so the idea is that if you think somebody is evil, if somebody's evil, then you've got the right to do anything to them. Torture them, bleed them, cut off their bodily parts, kill their children. They had a 24 meeting, or 24 show a while back, I guess that the international terrorism thing, where they actually had a guy's kids, and they started torturing the kids. It's unbelievable what they're doing in this. And this is a different value system, because every kid in school, right, and everybody in their life at some point has somebody they believe is nothing but absolute evil, who've been mistreating them or bullying them or been unfair to them. And when you teach kids that when somebody you think's evil, you have the right to do anything to them, that is exactly why we have a lot of this violence, as well as this culture of blood and violence that pervades our society.
Yes. I'm going to talk to a couple of things about you. We're going to have to do this again. We'll try to set this up next week and try to do something again with this, because there's so much I want to talk to you about. But sure. You talked about alcohol, drugs, cannabis is on the table, hemp, marijuana. What do you think? What is Louisiana's position if David Duke is senator? What is their position on marijuana?
Well, I'm one of these people in a lot of these issues. I'm pretty much of a libertarian, but there's a big difference between something of what's legal and what our community and our media and our culture should promote. I'm very much anti-drug, personally. I think the best way for us to be happy and healthy people is to have natural highs. By the exercises that we do, by climbing those mountains or swimming or using your body, eating the proper foods, sleeping properly. I believe in the primal lifestyle, but at the same time, I'm not in favor of a government restricting. But if we don't teach the right values, and we basically promote drugs like our media is doing for our young people, at that point, sometimes you've got to do something to kind of limit the flow.
Nice answer. I like that. That's very good. I'm with you too. I'm a libertarian when it comes to a lot of this. I think the problem with America is that we teach hedonism. We teach overindulgence. That's why alcohol doesn't work the way it would work in another country here, because we teach them get drunk, get wasted, get all of these things. And we're not teaching people moderation. Another thing that we're not teaching either, and I wonder how you would deal with this, I think that as Americans, we've lost the idea of conflict resolution. We don't deal well with people that we disagree with. We've been taught that if you disagree with someone, you can fight them. You kind of brought up the point that we can torture someone because we don't agree with them or because we feel like they bullied us. And if you think of what's happening right now with this idea of Black Lives Matter, they were actually Black people who got on television and explained away Black men shooting white police officers by saying, well, he should be able to lash out like that because of, instead of having a more constructive dialogue, we're now pushing destructive dialogue. What would David Duke like to see in the forms of constructive dialogue?
Well, I think that's the entire basis of what the United States of America is founded upon, and modern Western Christian civilization is founded upon. We have a long tradition, especially of our British forefathers and other European forefathers, and the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. You know, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of faith. And without freedom of speech, all other freedoms are endangered. Because if you don't have freedom of speech and they take away your rights, they kill you, they take away your property, they torture you or whatever, you don't have then the right to know about it. That's why freedom of speech is at the essential part of the whole rights issue. That's why our founding fathers, and by the way, I want to say something really clearly about this. When you talk about these ideas of freedom of speech, you're talking about a very long history and tradition of European peoples. We in this country, we had the Magna Carta, first for our British ancestors. We had the Mayflower Compact. So we literally, of course, we had the Constitution of the United States, we had the Declaration of Independence, and we enumerated these rights. I'm not trying to say anything bad about Africans. I'm not saying anything bad about the other peoples of the world, but freedom of speech, the idea of complete freedom of conscience and speech and thought, it's really a white thing. A lot of other peoples around the world have embraced it, thank God, but it's a concept, truly, anybody would have to admit it in terms of the democracies of the world, of the ideas of freedom of speech and thought and discourse and true debate is a European founded and a European spread concept around the world. Not that Europeans were always perfect in the application of it, but there's no question that European mankind has really promoted this idea all over the world, and including things like slavery. They often say how terrible it was that Europeans had slavery. Every people, as you know, Tommy, have had slavery. Black people enslaved other peoples and other tribes, which are just like other races in a real sense. They have different languages. Some of them even look different. They've been separated geographically, and they have, some of them are tall. They have different dress. They have different, same with Indian tribes, and they would enslave others. No people on this earth that ever existed that didn't have slavery. Slavery existed in Africa for thousands of years before white people had black slaves. Slavery existed in Europe before Corsair blacks, from North Africa came to the European coast and took our slaves. Slavery is not something that is endemic to white people. But let me tell you something, and I hope all black people understand this. White people didn't start slavery. In terms of the slavery of the African people, it was a tiny blip in historical sense, in terms of time, a few hundred years out of thousands of years. But white people basically ended it. Not only in white nations on their own. Black people didn't come to America and in slavery. Black people didn't come to Europe and in slavery. White people on their own decided that slavery was an immoral institution and they wanted to change it. And then all over the world, wherever the white people were, they began to eliminate those institutions. The British Navy went all over the world and they would stop slave ships on the high seas, wherever they were going. And they would turn them around, spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort. Sometimes they had to fight with them, these pirates and so forth. And they would make sure the ships went back to the port of embarkation where they came from. And they did everything they could to get those African slaves back to their homes, back to their homeland. And unfortunately, a lot of times they went back to their tribes and they went back to slavery there too. But at least, there's been no people on the face of the planet that have been more concerned about human rights and values than the European people. We've certainly done a lot of things that we're not proud of. Every people's has, but we're also very, very proud of the fact that when you talk about human rights today, you're talking about concepts that have been mostly promoted more than any other per capita anyway in the world by European Americans and Europeans.
Well, think about it. The country that's considered the leader in slavery has now become the country that is the leader in human rights. So that has to mean something. I mean, the country that blacks would assume was the leader and the group of people who were most racist became the first country of not that group, meaning Barack Obama, to allow that person to become leader of its country. That has to stand for something.
Yeah.
They went to war, and not over slavery, but millions of whites lost their lives in a fight which had something to do with one of the tentacles was slavery. It was whites versus whites. It wasn't whites versus blacks in the Civil War.
Yeah, and the truth is, and again, this is the history we don't realize because we have a media and an academic establishment that is meant to inflame and incite African Americans with hatred against white Americans, because they then want to use them as a political bloc vote and as a force to destroy the European American heritage. You've got to understand, we've talked about the subject before. We don't need to go into it all that tonight. That's a whole nother subject. But you've got to understand, European American Christians founded our universities. Every writer, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, were European Americans of European descent, not Middle Eastern descent, not African descent, not Asian descent, but European descent. And today, we are totally being discriminated against in the major universities that form the elite of America. Hollywood is not a white Christian institution. It's not the same people who built America. The people who control the banking institutions and the Federal Reserve are not the traditional white Christian men and women who created this country and value system. There is no white privilege in America. The truth is, there is an anti-white racism that pervades the national media, that pervades the academia of this country. It's been taken over, and that pervades actually our political establishment. That's why, as we talked earlier, no politician in this country, they could praise every other group. They could praise Mexican Americans, they can praise Black Americans, they can praise Jewish Americans, but no politician would dare say a kind word, a positive word about the white people by name. They might say, thanks to the people in my district, but they wouldn't say, and thank you. I must really appreciate, and I'm so thankful for the great white people who voted for me and put me into office and who represent this great heritage of America. You could say, and thanks to the great Mexicans who brought forth all, blah, 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 right? And the African Americans who helped build this country. But you can't even say a nice word about white people. And people
don't forget this, David.
Yep.
Remember when Hillary Clinton was accepting the nomination?
Yep.
How did she walk out on the stage to all of this montage of women, 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 women? A man could never do that.
That's right.
So again, I keep bringing it out.
Strategy, isn't it?
Yeah,
they do that. That's exactly what they do all the time. And again, it's not the founding fathers and mothers, but it's not the founding fathers. It's not saying anything against women, but you know, you look at the accomplishments of Western civilization and the science and the arts, and I can tell you something. I really believe this. This is what's ironic about this too. No people, no civilization has ever been more oriented toward freedom and respect and honor for women than Western civilization. I mean, Western civilization put them up on a pinnacle. Men were taught to literally sacrifice their lives, if necessary, to defend a woman's sanctity and honor, to defend their life. And this was the morality. This was the highest morality of the man, was to defend his wife and child. And it's still celebrated today, obviously. Nowadays, we have men that are being made into, you know the word cuckold. You know what that means, right?
Yes, sir.
We have men in this country. We are being propagandized by this Hollywood establishment to turn men into cuckolds. A cuckold is someone who abandons and gives over their wife or their woman and their children to the invader, all right, to the attacker, and maybe even has some sort of psychological pleasure about seeing their own women and their own people, their own bloodline being wiped out. It's all based on the cuckoo bird, which is the bird that raids other birds' nests. They push out and kill the progeny, the children of that nest. They take over the nest. They end up destroying the nest. They get the parents to feed this invader, this parasitical bird, rather than their own ancestry. There's no basic principle in life that is stronger than the idea that a man, a woman, a life form will protect their own children. They'll defend their own life and their own existence. It is a sick world that has taught European Americans to hate themselves and literally to celebrate their own destruction, their own ethnic cleansing in their own land. Every white person, all these white liberals, they'll say, you know, free Tibet. They'll say every people has a right to preserve their heritage. And it's horrible that genocide is the most horrible crime. And then they see a purposeful ethnic cleansing of European Americans in America, in Canada, and Europeans in every European country, and in Australia, New Zealand, the whole world. And they celebrate this. Oh, it's going to be great when there's no more people of our heritage and our value system. This is evil. And this is not an accident. This is not something that's come naturally out of our people. This has come by these predators who've taken over our media, our government, our politics, our finances, and they're purposefully wiping out my heritage. And in the process, they're not wiping out your heritage. Black people are not dying out. Like I said, the black people have the highest birth rate in the world of the African continent, and a fairly high one here, higher than European Americans. But you are suffering in many ways because the decline of the values this country was built upon makes your child have less opportunity to be safe and sound and drug-free and healthy, and not be shot down on the steps of her home, and not, you know, be a victim in this society than maybe what they had before. And I also believe one more thing. I got to say something else too.
I'll give you your last word. I'll give you your last word on this topic, and we're gonna have to revisit this thing again. This has been good, but we want to break it up. But go ahead.
Well, I also believe that I'm a white person, and I believe that we're a vast majority of this country. And I believe as long as America is guided by the values of the founders of this country, the people who wrote the Declaration, who gave us our Constitution, I think this will be a better country for us. And I think it'll be a better country for you. At the same time, I recognize the inherent human right of every people all over the world to determine their own destiny and have the right to choose their own destiny and to rule their own affairs and their own environment. So I support absolutely that every nation on the earth, first off, has the right to be free and independent, the same principle America was founded upon, the Declaration of Independence. And I also believe that in a society like in America, that groups have every right to try to gather themselves together, to try to control their own communities and have a community that reflects their spirit and their values. And we have a good example of this in Europe. We have Switzerland, right? And Switzerland has been there many times. Switzerland has people of Italian heritage, they have German heritage, they have French heritage, and they have what's called cantons. And each of these cantons has the right to set the major language of that area. Some areas of Switzerland speak Italian. Some areas of Switzerland speak French. Some areas of Switzerland speak German. And it works because each individual peoples has those rights. And I believe that's right. I think forced integration of the races is actually something that creates friction, creates hatreds, and creates these identity politics of struggle, rather than makes a nation more at peace and more with a sense of a national destiny. I think to understand the fact that there are real differences among people. There are differences in religious beliefs. There are differences in race. There's differences in culture, differences in language, differences in musical styles. To understand that these differences are good, I think is, and there are really an inherent right that these differences do exist is a good thing. The problem is when you force people in against the will of the people of these different cultures and different races, and that's where the problems come about. That's where the hatred arises. That's where the civil wars arise. The United Nations shows that the biggest single cause of the civil wars and genocides around the world is ethnic conflicts within nations. And when you combine ethnic and religious, it's like lighting a fuse to a stick of dynamite. The truth is, America is not stronger together with people who are very alien to our culture, our religious values. People are always stronger when they're more united. And the most natural basis of being united is with a common language, a common culture, a common heritage, a common value system, and a dominant people in a particular society that created the society. That's just like ABC. That's just like the fundamental building blocks of society. Nations themselves were created by tribes. France, the Franks. Germans, the Germans. We can just go on and on. We have to understand that nations are really a reflection of the people, the culture, the genetics, the unique quality of those people. Multiculturalism, or the idea that there's a diversity on the planet, that's a good thing. But you can't have a true diversity on the planet if you force people together, because what that happens, that causes conflict. I'll give you one last example, and I'll let you go. There's, and I got to go too. I got some schedules. I got a lot of campaigning to do tomorrow. There was a big article in the Washington Post the other day about the fact that there is a existential crisis for the polar bear. Now, I know there's a lot of people in America that don't want to save the polar bear because, after all, the polar bear is white. but the polar bear is really a unique bear with unique characteristics. In fact, the way the pads are on their feet, that they can navigate the ice flows, they're a really beautiful form of nature. And the scientists were talking about the fact that the polar bear is facing an existential crisis today. There's a lot of warming going on, whether it's man-made or whether it's simply cyclical. We're not sure yet. At least some people aren't sure. But the polar bear, their habitat is being shrunk, and because of the warming areas, the brown bears, which are very different than polar bears, but they can breed with polar bears. And the brown male bears are going to the Arctic and breeding with the polar bears, and they're literally destroying this unique breed of life called the polar bear. And of course, every scientist and every true ecologist says what a loss this would be if this unique form of life would be lost from the planet, from the Earth. And if you think about it, if it's worthy to save a polar bear or a brown bear or a panda bear or whatever in China, if that's important, shouldn't we try to preserve and save every unique expression of humanity and the myriad of culture and creation that these expressions can create? Forcing races together produces conflict, produces hatred, and destroys the diversity of life and the diversity of culture that so enriches this earth. That's what I believe in. I believe in true diversity, and that also includes the preservation of my form of diversity, which is the European peoples.
I like it. And I think that everyone should be able to have racial pride. I don't like that idea of everyone being able to have racial pride and then women having pride in being women and everyone able to throw this in your face. Like you said, a backlash is coming, and I think it's being pushed for a reason to get that backlash. Thank you so much, Dr. David Duke. And remember, guys, make sure you go check him out at what is your website? Make sure they can have the website.
Yeah, one more urging. Right now, we need to raise $250,000, really, because they said 200,000, but they're already talking about raising it. They're trying to keep me out of the debates because they want to suppress the things I'm saying, even on this program, the issues that I'm talking about. So they don't want me to be in the debates because they know in the debates I'll win, that I will be different than all the other candidates, that I'll talk about issues these other candidates don't dare talk about, and that I'll win. So we need to raise this money, and I'm really asking all of your listeners who really want to see someone who's going to smash this corrupt banking and political establishment that's leading this nation and all of our people to disaster, find someone who's going to smash that establishment and start getting the people's voice in the United States Senate. You can go to Duke for Senate, that's dukeforsenate.com or davidduke.com, and you'll find links there, and just click on the donate button and just send us whatever you can. You don't have to give a lot. Some of you are able to give the maximum. We need that too. But I'm not taking any PAC money. I'm not going to have any money from Goldman Sachs like these other sellouts. I depend on you. A lot of us together, and I'm going to have more contributors than almost any other campaign in this whole country before this is over. And we're a movement of the people, and I really need your support. If we go to the United States Senate, it'll be the most powerful revolutionary act perhaps in the history of America. It will absolutely shock the country and the world, and it will start a discussion of these ideas, a lot of them we talked about tonight, Tommy, that must be addressed, that must be confronted if our people are to be prosperous, if our people are to be, well, if our people in this country, all people, are going to have a better life and a better and a freer nation. Thank you so much.
You know what? Thank you for coming on to the show, and thank you guys for being a respectful audience. If they want to email you and ask you some questions, where can they email you at? You have the audience right here. Maybe some of them didn't get a question answered, or maybe they want to do something personally for you. How can they get in contact?
You're welcome to do that. You can go to davidduke.com, and then you can go to contact David Duke personally, and you can send an email to me that way. It's very, very easy. And you can also send a message to me on Duke for Senate. So I'll be happy to read your emails. I want to hear from you. I appreciate you all, and I appreciate your open-mindedness about me. I know that there's so much lies about me in the media, all this KKK blah, blah, blah 4 decades ago. But I know that the reason why they do this to me, and they don't do it to Bernie Sanders' communist past, or Robert Byrd's Klan past, or Hillary Clinton's hero of Benghazi past, is because they fear what I'm saying today, and they fear the fact that I'm a threat to these bankers and these establishment politicians that are really destroying the foundations of Western Christian civilization, and they know that. And that's why they throw the labels on me day and night. But I like it now because it's got to the point, it's like part of my birth certificate, because every time they do that, it makes people realize how biased this media is. And so I'm not ashamed of anything. I'm just proud of the fact, actually, that all my life, whether it's been personally favorable to me or not, I've always stood up and said what I believe to be the truth. Some people have said to me, well, with your past, how can we trust you and what you're saying? And my answer to that is, my past is proof that you can trust me. My past is proof that I'm a man who's not stood up and said what was popular or what could better serve his personal interests, but what he actually believed and what I actually thought. And my past is very different than the way the media presents me, but at least you know that I have a past of a man who stood up for what he believed and will always be honest with you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I like it. Hey, thank you so much for joining the show, and thank you guys for joining the show. We're going to do this again. I'm going to see if I can talk Dr. Duke into doing this again sometime in more of a formal setting, and have some phone calls come through, and maybe answer some of you guys' phone calls. There's so many questions I didn't get a chance to get to, but thank you for taking out a couple of hours out of your night, Dr. Duke, and out of your night, audience. This has been TNN News Raw.